This week saw a 3-day NATO summit, marking the 75th anniversary of the Security Alliance's founding. It came at a momentous time in world history, and indeed the history of the organisation itself, with Ukraine's difficult war situation and the increasingly likely second Trump presidency, which promises to be more isolationist than the first, gave members an agenda to chew on that went to the heart of what the alliance was meant to be about. And by all accounts, some progress was made, but it was largely overshadowed by 4 different issues that were hanging over the summit and dominating discussion. The first of these, well, that would be the looming shadow of
Vice President Trump.
He was clearly on Joe Biden's mind, but for all the attendees, they were having to consider the various scenarios that could play out during a second Trump term. Bearing in mind, Trump's boasts and promises are not all that reliable a guide as to what he will actually do. It left a wide range of possibilities on the table. One of them was trailed by one of Trump's few fans at the gathering, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who took the opportunity to visit Trump and then to return to the summit, declaring good news that Trump was going to solve the Russia-Ukraine war. No details as to how this specific miracle was going to be attained, although realistically the only leverage Trump really has is to threaten to withhold support from Ukraine unless it concedes to a substantial portion of Russian demands. Orban seems to have taken the opportunity of Hungary having the European Union presidency for 6 months as a platform to launch him as an iconoclastic peacemaker. He kicked off with a visit to Ukraine, scandalised other EU leaders with a visit to Russia, where he was to be seen warmly embracing Putin, and then to Beijing. Bear in mind, nobody had requested this sort of intervention from Viktor Orban, and particularly because his visits had been presented by his hosts as having a European representative aspect, this was something the EU was not remotely happy about. But really, the Orban circus was a sideshow. In reality, Trump hovered over proceedings simply by dint of being seen to be making ground at the expense of his opponent, and therefore the likelihood of his return being better than even. Of course, it wasn't only him hanging over the summit. It was also,
Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin.
For the second time, Putin had preceded the summit by floating the idea of peace negotiations. His first ceasefire proposal was floated 2 days before Ukraine's peace summit in Switzerland, clearly intended to upstage Kyiv's initiative in that case, and then again in advance of this summit at last week's Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Kazakhstan. Of course, the proposals he put forward are not acceptable to Ukraine or its partners. He gave his conditions for a ceasefire, the Ukrainian withdrawal from numerous regions, not all of which Russia even currently occupies, along with the abandonment of Ukraine's ambition to join NATO. Offering talks at this point mostly serves to add pressure to avoid early action on Ukraine's NATO membership, and to seek to exploit possible divisions and uncertainty between NATO members. Arguably, he is also encouraged to take action by that prospect of a second Trump presidency. Putin, being the inveterate scenario player, is reportedly somewhat wary of a second Trump term. While he might welcome the prospect of chaos disrupting US politics, his major fear would be a rapid deterioration of US-China relations, which could end up putting Russia in the crossfire between the two, while it's still strategically weakened from the ongoing sanctions and war. The UK's Chatham House think tank noted recently that, regardless of Trump's stated high regard for Putin, his first presidential term had not brought the rewards that Moscow had hoped for, and that there was no particular reason to presume a second one would be much different. In spite of Trump's boasts, in advance of how he would solve the war. In the meantime, Russia is playing a deadlier game than that being played out in American politics. This week, CNN reported that Russian authorities had been thwarted from assassination attempts against leading figures in the European defence industry. US and Western officials had told the news network that US intelligence had uncovered a plan early this year to assassinate the chief executive of German arms manufacturer Rheinmetall. The Americans tipped off the German authorities, who were able to foil the plot. But this, it turned out, was just one of multiple planned assassinations. Of course, one of the other things hanging over the NATO summit, arguably the biggest, the most visible thing, was President Joe Biden's beleaguered situation over his diminishing cognitive abilities. He was aiming to put those fears to one side with what was labelled as a big boy press conference. The somewhat juvenile label intended to designate that he would be asked unscripted questions by journalists for an extended period of time, which really rather highlighted how weird the status quo has become. If having such a press conference, called normal by everyone else, has become so unusual it gets called a big boy event, unlike Biden's usual events. Which is really the point. A president who does very little of the normal stuff a president would do, who, when he does, has everyone hanging on his words, fascinated by the unpredictability of what might come out of his mouth next.
Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin. President Putin. He's going to beat President Putin. President Zelensky.
That really is the problem right there. And that is what the NATO summit attendees couldn't escape. While they would have wanted to be discussing the political progress that they felt was made at the summit, the various leaders present were asked instead by reporters what they personally felt about Joe Biden's mental fitness. Now, this is one of those questions that gets asked purely on the off chance that the interviewee is stupid enough to answer it honestly, which of course would result in an instant headline to the damage of the politician concerned and the tainted glory of the journalists who asked it. In other words, it's almost certainly a complete waste of time and a distraction from more important issues, but it's more than a journalist's job's worth for them not to give it a go anyway. So we had German Chancellor Olaf Scholz stating his confidence in Joe Biden's cognitive abilities, saying it would be a big mistake to underestimate him. Newly elected British Prime Minister Keir Starmer insisting that Biden had been on really good form during their hour-long bilateral meeting. The fact you even have to say it is kind of a problem. The President of Finland, Alexander Stubb, saying that he had absolutely no concerns about Biden's ability, and French President Macron, whose press conference immediately followed Biden's gaffes, where he called President Zelensky President Putin and Vice President Harris Vice President Trump. He defended Biden's errors, saying that lapses happen to everyone, it could even happen to him tomorrow. Arguably following Macron's rather damaging decision to call a parliamentary election totally out of the blue, which has now left his country facing political gridlock as a result, he has rather bigger gaffes standing against him than any such verbal slips. But he at least is safe in his position until 2027. The question remains for Biden whether unsettled Democrats will make a final last-ditch push to get him out the way. It's patently obvious to the world that Biden is bleeding credibility and support. His position would be considered untenable in most political environments. But in the absence of a mechanism that can force him to stand down, and in the absence of the kind of humility and self-awareness that would inform him to make a well-judged decision, it could still really go either way. The clock, however, is ticking. If he's in place in a couple of weeks' time, he's almost certainly going to be the candidate. On current momentum, that is likely to be the gift that gives Trump his second term in the White House. And then, well, the NATO summits will get really interesting.